Hello, everyone. If you are just joining us now, we have breaking news to report. 3 U.S. service members have been killed in Jordan. There are also 25 others who have been injured. Those numbers may change. We are continuing to bring you all the updates as we have them. We understand that an Iranian-backed militia group is responsible for those attacks. I want to bring in now retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery. He is the senior director of the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Admiral, thank you for being here. When you hear something like this, that 3 U.S. service members have actually been killed, 25 others are wounded, and it is unclear the extent of those injuries, what is the very first thing that comes to mind for you?
Well, thank you for having me, Lana. And obviously, the first thing is the same thing the president said, which is that we have a lot of our condolences for the families, and I hope it remains at only 3 killed in action. But with this kind of attack and those high numbers of wounded, it could grow. So first, our empathy and our support and condolences for those families. And the second is that we need to hold the right people accountable for this attack, because this is a significant attack against us, and one that was probably inevitable.
Well, and in terms of holding people responsible, which is what the president has said must happen in his statement that was released, we're seeing Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator, saying that there should be strikes in Iran. Iran, of course, backing the militia group that has assumed responsibility for this. What goes into the consideration of determining whether the United States should take that type of action? Because so much of this has been, in many ways, a proxy fight. All of these skirmishes, 160 of them since the beginning of the Israel-Hamas war. Does it make sense for the U.S. to carry out strikes in Iran, and do you think that that's likely going to happen?
So I think when you make that decision, you have to balance, can you hold the, sufficient amount of accountability for Iran that you deter future action? And the second is a risk analysis of what the risk would be for U.S. forces in a direct strike on Iran. I do think we have a lot of people to hold accountable at this point that would not, that doesn't require striking inside Iran. We can certainly hold. There've been 100+ attacks by nearly a dozen IRGC, Iranian Revolutionary Guard-backed militias in Syria and Iraq. Those attacks have been into Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. And we could certainly hold all those groups accountable. Instead of doing a one nightly strike, do a campaign against all those groups simultaneously. And then the second group I'd hold accountable are the IRGC forces that are resident in Syria and Iraq. And we've done that a couple of times, but we've also done things like warn the Iranians we're about to attack. I think that needs to end. I think we need to hold those militias accountable, and then hold the IRGC enablers that are forward deployed accountable.
When you're talking about holding the IRGC forces accountable, those being in Syria, I'm remembering the Obama-Biden administration and questions about whether the United States would involve itself in a war, and President Obama's then red line with Syria and all of the considerations and the debates that took place around that. How does the United States becoming involved in a conflict with Syria, even if it's strikes on militia groups in Syria, how does that play into these greater questions about escalation in the region?
So I do think that President Obama's red line on Syria was shown to be a failure. I think President Trump was more aggressive in strikes against IRGC and against Iranian allies in Syria and in Iraq, and eventually he did order the killing of General Soleimani, the head of the IRGC in Iraq. So to my instinct, we can do sufficient cost imposition on targets in Syria and Iraq that prevent a kind of large, broad escalation. But it's going to take a more aggressive stance than the United States has been willing to take over the last 2 years. I think we still harbor some kind of hope of a rapprochement with Iran around their nuclear program, and that it inhibits our action to do the right thing about these attacks. This was inevitable. This is more than 100 attacks on U.S. forces. It was a mix of luck and some good missile defense. that prevented this in the past. It's now happened, and the Biden administration is really on the hook to do the right thing here and do an aggressive, persistent campaign against all these militias, against the IRGC support networks in Syria and Iraq. And if that doesn't deter Iran, then eventually we'll have to consider Iran. But I think it's, Senator Graham is probably overly aggressive in going directly after targets in Iran right now, if that's what he was actually saying.
Well, that was from his office, a release. Admiral, what can you tell us about Kataib Hezbollah, or KH, the group that is believed to be responsible for these attacks?
So I haven't seen them responsible for any of the previous attacks, but that doesn't mean they weren't. We have some trouble with the attribution of exact drone attacks. I will tell you, a drone that can do this kind of damage was not locally, fabricated. This would be, needs to come from Iran or a similar country, and really the only country that's doing this right now, providing this kind of support to these militia groups is Iran. So I think it's reasonable to hold that Iran logistically and potentially situational awareness, intelligence-wise, supported this group in launching this kind of attack. So from my perspective, this fits the model of the dozen plus organizations in Iraq and Syria that have made a business for the last 3 months of attacking U.S. forces relentlessly in Iraq and Syria, and now Jordan, and indeed, if you could tie this to the Houthis as well, attacking our forces at sea. This is a persistent campaign being run by Iran. The same thing needs to be done by the United States back against these militia groups.
And Admiral, I understand as this is breaking news, I want to read for our viewers and for you as well what specifically Senator Graham said. Quote, the Biden administration can take out all the Iranian proxies they like, but it will not deter Iranian aggression. I'm calling on the Biden administration to strike targets of significance inside Iran, not only as reprisal for the killing of our forces, but as a deterrence against future aggression. The only thing the Iranian regime understands is force until they pay a price with their infrastructure and their personnel. The attacks on U.S. troops will continue. The question about these proxy groups, because Iran has backed and funded and in some cases controls these groups that are operating in countries outside of Iran. What do you make of Senator Graham's statement in terms of the necessity, as he says, to actually target Iran personnel infrastructure inside the country specifically?
So I think Senator Graham is probably reflecting a lot of frustration that exists in the Congress and probably in the American public at the inability to deter Iranian efforts. I do think there's one step before the attacks on Iran, and that's a serious, persistent pressure campaign, striking campaign against these militias and against IRGC supporting elements in Iraq and Syria. We haven't done that. And when we have struck them, we've given the Iranians warning that we're striking so that at least their, IRGC personnel get out of the way. To me, I would do this. I would do something short of striking Iran first. If that doesn't work, then I'd strike Iran. But I mean, we're at the point now where, there is a step between now and something that could lead to a broader regional conflict. And I just think, I understand the frustration. I understand the administration hasn't done near enough given what's happened, but I don't think that means you jump to the significantly, I think, riskier and more consequential step of, mainland strikes against Iran.
I want to pull back and discuss the lives that were actually lost, because this is a heavy day for those families, for all that support the U.S. troops. I know that you spent 32 years in the U.S. Navy as a nuclear-trained surface warfare officer and retired as a rear admiral. What's going on in terms of how those families are going to be notified, how the United States supports the loss of lives there?
That's a great question. First, I do think that while this is against one facility, that facility will have held people from numerous units, but I think the units will be concentrated in one or two geographic locations in the United States. So this is some very bad news being delivered to some small communities in the United States. I think the military has, over the last 23 years, become unfortunately very good at family support on these issues, in terms of spiritual, economic, and just administrative support to the families. In the end, nothing the military can say can bring their families back or heal significant injuries. Certainly, we can heal some of the physical ones on the wounded. But I think the U.S. Armed Forces have become very good at this. I think there's a good system for it. The U.S. Army, particularly, is effective, and I think that's what we're going to find. The vast majority of these injured and killed soldiers are U.S. Army forces. But what I'll also say is that there is nothing the U.S. military can do to compensate for the life of a young woman or man that's killed in combat.
Thank you for that. You're retired now, Admiral, but if you were advising the president about next steps, what would you say?
I am confident that the Central Command planners have a extensive, persistent cost imposition campaign plan that they can impose on these groups. To get a little closer to Senator Graham, I would say you could add in, an economic element of this that gets even tougher on Iran. We can really twist the arms of our European partners, who are sometimes soft in their sanctioning of Iran, to strengthen their sanctions and strengthen the enforcement of their sanctions, and hold Iran accountable for their support. So to me, those are the two big steps I'd take. A persistent air campaign against these militia groups and the IRGC enablers, and then a economic campaign against the Iranian state itself.
All right. Retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, thank you.
Thank you for having me, Lana.